despite doubts, the search for better opportunities is alive and kicking in the U.S. Companies have chased lower property and wage costs as well as lax regulation, and people have followed them for the job opportunities. In particular, states like Texas and Arizona, and to some degree, different states in the South, have enjoyed a certain amount of economic growth because companies have chosen to relocate in them. That said, unless you've been living under a rock, you've probably noticed that the political and physical climate has changed quite dramatically in the U.S. South and Southwest. People who live or are considering moving to these regions should consider at least three factors. The three factors are extreme heat affecting your personal and your family's health. The second is extreme weather. This includes the heat, but it also includes the more frequent and more frequently powerful storms that we're going to all be enjoying, put that in quotes, and how that affects your daily life and your cost of living. The last topic I want to touch on is the political climate. Now, I'm going to shove this off to the last because, people probably had enough of politics, but there are a few things I would ask people to think about. But I'll save that to the end, like I said. The heat domes we've been experiencing are by far the most serious development to consider with respect to your own and your family's health. Simply put, a heat index at or above 95 degrees, that's 35 degrees Celsius, can kill a healthy adult or put them in the hospital. The very young, the old, the overweight, people who are ill or on medications can succumb to heat far more easily. And it's not pretty to see somebody just keel over from heat exhaustion. I've seen it out in the wilderness where the rest of us had to give first aid. It's scary. A wet bulb temperature of 95 degrees is not the minimum that can kill people. The heat dome that lingered over the Pacific Northwest in 2021 had a wet bulb temperature closer to 77 degrees. That's 25 degrees Celsius. 1,400 people died. And last year's heat waves in Europe killed somewhere around 60,000 people. Consider for a moment what it means going about your daily life with a heat index of 95 degrees or higher. If you have a car breakdown, you got kids in the car, you're in the car, and maybe it's 45 minutes before you can get out of the heat. And that might be really dangerous for all of you. So, yeah, it's I'm trying to. If it sounds like I'm trying to scare you, I am. You need to take these things into consideration because for some families, that risk may not be worth it. Saving yourself from overheating in high temperatures is not as straightforward as you might think. When your body can cool itself, the reasonably healthy person can withstand the heat. It's a lot of stress on your cardiovascular system because your heart is pumping blood to your extremities, you're sweating, you're losing a lot of fluids. So you've got to drink fluids, you've got to be dressed adequately, you have to have airflow over your body. But understand, when the heat index exceeds human survivability, you can't sweat. You can't cool. The only way to cool is to either get into water, in a shower, or in a pool, or in the ocean, or get into an air-conditioned building. Okay? That includes your house. So, I'm trying to present to you the things that you should consider. living in an area that might be subject to extremely high heat indices. High heat is less of a problem in arid environments, but if you're anywhere near the coast, watch out, because that'll kill you. To read from the CDC on this matter, they go on to say, quote, electric fans may provide comfort, but when the temperature is in the high 90s, fans will not prevent heat-related illness. Taking a cold shower or bath or moving to an air-conditioned place is a much better way to cool off. Air conditioning is the strongest protective factor against heat-related illness. Exposure to air conditioning for even a few hours a day will reduce the risk for heat-related illness. Consider visiting a shopping mall or public library for a few hours a day. So let that sink in. You'll be dependent on a pool or being indoors or on your car AC. And I hope your car is in good condition. Remember that while air conditioning is the best way to cool down, remember that the grid can fail, your AC unit can fail both in your house and in your car. And at that point, you and your family can face life-threatening conditions if there's no remedy and there's no escape to some way to cool off, whether that's a shower or a pool or a cooling center or a shopping mall. It's not good. So with that bit of cheery news out of the way, let's move on to emergence of extreme weather. Extreme weather, of course, includes both the heat and also the kind of wacky storms we've been seeing, and we might see later in hurricane season, that have caused the insurance companies to abandon entire states. And this is of consequence mainly to the Gulf states, like Louisiana, Texas, Florida, all have large amount of exposure to Gulf weather and Gulf hurricanes, other storms. And if you can't get insurance, you can't purchase a mortgage. If you can't get insurance, you're at risk for the next storm. If you can't get insurance, neither can the person who would have otherwise bought your house. So you really are working from a position where you might get stuck where you're living and not have an option to move because you can't afford to buy a house outright unless you sell the one you're in. So that might be for those who are thinking about moving into these storm-prone areas, one-way trip. And for those who are there, you might consider your options now about being able to move elsewhere. Southwest still has a very significant water issue with respect to the Colorado River. Flat out, despite the reprieve we've been given from last year's snow, the Colorado River flow is oversubscribed. There's more demand, more water allocated than flows in that river on average. And the river is slated to shrivel by another 20% over the next 30 or 40 years. And this is going to put very consistent pressure on all parties who are dependent on the Colorado River to find a way to cut back on use. Unfortunately, the most powerful and most influential elements, not the cities, it's not even LA, although it's quite large, it's alfalfa farmers. People may not know, but 80% of the Colorado's river is given to agricultural use. 80% of that water is used for fodder, like alfalfa, which consumes an amazing amount of water. That alfalfa is exported, and it's fed to cattle that are exported. And that water is in competition with all the other uses we could make for that water, whether it's for winter vegetables that feed us directly, water for cities, industry, hydropower, wildlife, the First Nations, the people that were here first. Everyone else is standing in line behind the largest consumer of water, which is farmers, some of which are now owned by Saudi Arabia, that grow alfalfa and basically export our water abroad. Okay? Drought years are probably going to come back. We don't know what rain is going to look like in the coming years because climate change. It keeps, things are continuing to change. That means that whatever we see this year, it probably isn't quite going to play out the same way as next year. And by that, I mean much more significantly than any of us would expect with the way things were 30 years ago. Okay, 30 years ago, you could expect spring to pop up certain months of the year. Rains would come, a certain set of months, certain amount of rain would come. Maybe it's a little more, maybe it's a little less. Maybe there's a drought here or there. But you could rely on that supply. That world is dead. Okay? You can thank big oil for that. Gonzo. One last little tidbit. You may not know, but suburbia is a Ponzi scheme. If you're thinking of moving to or are living in an area that consists mostly of suburbia, if it's over 20 years, it's financially in the red. The reason why? Because your property taxes only cover 10% of the maintenance costs of all the infrastructure, the roads, the sewer lines, the water lines. And if your city has any issue expanding, say from an economic downturn or from water restrictions that prevent new development, it will run into financial trouble. So, caveat emptor, be careful of where you live and where you might move to. So it turns out I don't have a whole lot of energy left for the last part I was going to discuss, but I am going to say this much. Just remember that I think it's 12 or 16 attorneys general for Republican states, Florida and Texas are there, of course. They are seeking the power to subpoena, I guess is the right term, medical records for procedures that you or your family might undergo outside of their state. The intent is to determine whether those procedures are considered illegal in the states you live in. Okay, let that soak in. Is the procedures that they wouldn't come up and say, well, we don't like them, they're illegal. And if you go out of state to have, your teeth cleaned, I guess, and they decide that's illegal, they want the right to be able to criminally charge you for something that is legal in another state because you're a resident of their state. They want to be able to have the power to criminally charge you. I want you to just think about that for a moment. What that means is they own you. Right now, it's limited to the targets of their obsession, which is women's reproductive health care and trans people. But once the precedent is set, which I agree is an incredibly high bar, They could make that into anything, any law. Things they don't like in Texas, well, if you're, you know, a subject of Texas, you can't do anything they don't want you to do outside of the state. That's a huge invasion of and destruction of your civil liberties. And considering that Florida tried but backed off of being able to basically follow girls' menstrual cycles, basically to become deeply involved, intimately involved in their reproductive organs, God knows what else they would figure out they wanted to inspect. If I were young and thinking about having a family, basically a Republican state would be absolutely the last place I would want to live. Not until the party gets a lobotomy and has a completely new brain installed in them. It's scary what they're after. And you should be very careful about putting yourself under their thumb. Okay? Just saying.